The longest stone arch railroad bridge in the world is hiding in plain sight, just north of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 48 stone arches, every one of them a 70-foot span, 3,820 feet of cut masonry, straight across the Susquehanna River, finished in the spring of 1902, and still carrying heavy mainline trains today. People photograph the trains crossing it every weekend of the year, and almost none of them know that every single one of those 48 arches was raised, stone, by hand. The man who decided to build it that way was the chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad, William H. Brown, and he was working under a railroad president named Alexander Cassatt, who had set out to rebuild the line's most important bridges to last effectively forever. The men who worked under Brown had a nickname for him. They called him the Stone Man, because year after year, from 1900 to 1906, he kept putting up 2 and 3 heavy stone arch bridges a season, when the whole rest of the industry had already moved on to iron and steel. The bridge at Rockville was his masterpiece. It is the largest thing of its kind ever built, and I want to walk you through how it actually went up, because the finished bridge is so calm and so permanent that it hides the work completely. That is the strange thing about this bridge, and it is the reason I wanted to tell you about it. A great iron cantilever announces its own difficulty. You look at it and you can see the engineering straining. A stone arch does the opposite. It sits there looking like it grew out of the riverbed, like it was always going to be there, and it gives you no sense at all of the 300 men who spent 2 years cutting and lifting and setting the stones one by one to make it. That calm is what they achieved, and my job here is to put the work back into it. So let me set the scene, because the place and the moment both mattered. This is the Pennsylvania Railroad, at the turn of the 20th century, and it called itself the Standard Railroad of the World, and it was not bragging. The stretch of main line running from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was one of the busiest and most profitable pieces of railroad on the planet, and it had to cross the wide Susquehanna at Rockville, about 5 miles above Harrisburg. Every through train between the East Coast and the whole interior of the country funneled across that one river crossing. And by the 1890s, the crossing had become a chokehold. The trains were heavier every year, and there were more of them every year, and the bridge standing there could not keep up. Cassatt's policy runs right through this whole story, so let me put it plainly. He wanted the Pennsylvania's critical structures rebuilt to last, not for 20 years, but effectively forever, so the railroad would never again have to tear up its busiest crossings to replace a worn-out bridge. He set that direction from the president's office. Brown, the stoneman, was the man who turned that direction into stone and mortar. And the engineer who actually stood out on the river and supervised the building of it was one of Brown's assistants, a man named George Nauman. Keep those 3 in mind. A president who wanted permanence, a chief engineer who believed only stone could deliver it, and the assistant who ran the work in the water. To understand why Brown reached for stone in the age of steel, you have to know what had already stood at Rockville, because this was the 3rd bridge on the spot, and each one taught the railroad something it did not want to learn. The first bridge went up in 1849. It opened on the 1st of September that year, and it was a wooden bridge, 23 spans of Howe truss timber, reinforced with heavy arches along the outside faces. The design named for the man who patented it, carrying a single track on stone piers. It ran something like 3,600 feet across the river, which made it, even then, one of the longer railroad bridges in the country. For its day, it was a serious piece of work, and it lasted for decades. It carried the Pennsylvania Railroad, and later the trains of the Northern Central as well, and it even survived a fire in 1868. But it was timber, and it was single track, and by the 1870s the traffic pouring across the Susquehanna had already outgrown a single wooden line. So in 1877, the railroad replaced it, and here is a detail I love, because it shows how fast these men could work when the design was familiar and the material was iron. From July to December of 1877, in a single half of a year, the Delaware Bridge Company put up a new double-track iron bridge, and they did it by building on extensions of the old stone piers that were already standing in the river. Iron deck trusses, lattice work, 2 tracks where there had been one. That was the modern answer in 1877. Iron was lighter than timber. Iron went up faster. Iron did not burn. And iron was what every ambitious railroad in America was building with. And for a while it did the job. But that iron bridge was in service for barely 2 decades before it, too, began to choke the main line, and iron truss bridges in that era had a darker record than the industry liked to admit. This is the part of the story where the real adversary steps forward, and it is not a person, it is a material and its limits. Across the 1870s and 1880s, iron and early steel truss bridges in America failed, sometimes catastrophically, sometimes with a train on them, because the metal fatigued under the pounding of traffic, or rusted where nobody was maintaining it, or was simply too light for loads that kept growing heavier every year than the men who designed it had ever planned for. Brown watched all of that happen across the industry. His argument, which he made plainly, and which the whole Rockville project is built on, was that on a railroad's busiest routes, where maintenance is always being deferred under the sheer pressure of keeping the trains moving, an iron bridge is a standing risk. It needs constant, careful inspection and repair that a hard-run main line will never reliably give it. Stone needs almost none. A stone arch does not fatigue, and it does not rust, and there is nothing in it to corrode or to snap. Left alone, a well-built stone arch simply stands, and goes on standing, and that was the entire point. And this was not a one-off notion of Brown's, it was a program. Under Cassatt's push for permanence, Brown spent the first years of the new century systematically tearing out the Pennsylvania's aging iron bridges along the Philadelphia to Pittsburgh line and replacing them with heavy stone arches, 2 and 3 of them a year from 1900 to 1906. That is the campaign that earned him the name the Stoneman. Rockville was the largest and most ambitious of all of them, the crown of the whole effort, but it was one piece of a deliberate decision to rebuild the busiest railroad in America out of the oldest building material there is. There was one more reason a stone bridge was even thinkable at Rockville, and it is the kind of thing that decides these projects long before the first stone is cut. The rock was in the right place. The Susquehanna at that crossing is wide but shallow, and the solid bedrock lies just below the bottom of the river. That single geological fact is what made the whole enormous idea practical, because it meant the piers of a heavy stone bridge, and there would be dozens of them, could be founded directly on rock without sinking deep, expensive foundations through mud. The river handed Brown a stone floor to build on. He decided to build a stone bridge on it, and so, in the spring of 1900, the Pennsylvania Railroad set out to raise the largest stone bridge the world had ever seen, right beside the iron one it was going to retire. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. Now let me walk you through the design itself, because this is where the intelligence of the thing lives, and it answers a question you should already be asking. How do you build something the better part of a mile long, out of stone, across a live river, when a bridge that size cannot possibly be finished in a single working season, and cannot even be built by a single contractor? The answer Brown's office worked out is quietly brilliant, and most people who admire the bridge never notice it. The bridge is 48 arches, each a 70-foot span, and it is 52 feet wide enough to carry 4 tracks of railroad side by side. If you just built 48 identical piers and sprang 48 identical arches between them, you would have a problem. An arch pushes sideways as much as it pushes down. Each arch leans on its neighbors, and the whole line of them only holds because the thrust of each one is balanced by the thrust of the next, all the way to the solid abutments at the ends. Which means that until the very last arch is closed, you have an unbalanced structure, a row of arches all shoving outward with nothing yet to push back against at the working end. Build it naively, and an unfinished bridge tries to tear itself apart. So the engineers did something clever. They made every 8th pier much thicker than the others. Most of the piers are about 8 feet wide, but every 8th one is 19 feet wide, more than twice as heavy, and those fat piers are called abutment piers. Each one is massive enough to stand on its own and absorb the sideways thrust of a run of arches all by itself, as if it were a solid bank of earth. And that turns the whole bridge into 6 separate stretches of 8 arches each, 6 sections, divided by those 6 heavy abutment piers, every section able to stand complete and stable on its own, whether or not the section next to it was finished yet. Think about what that bought them. It meant the work could stop and start. It meant a section could be left standing safely over a winter. It meant the eastern half of the bridge could be built by one company and the western half by another, working toward each other, without either one depending on the other to hold up its arches. The Pennsylvania hired 2 Philadelphia contractors and split the river between them, Drake and Stratton working from the eastern shore and H.S. Kerbaugh working from the west. The abutment piers are the reason 2 separate crews could carve up a single continuous bridge and each build their piece in confidence. That design decision, invisible to almost everyone who looks at the bridge, is what made a structure this large actually buildable by hand in the time they had. Let me give you the actual proportions of the thing, because the numbers in the engineering record are what make it real. Each of the 48 arches is a segmental arch, meaning it is a shallow slice of a circle rather than a tall half-round, and each one springs from its piers on a radius of about 40 feet and rises 20 feet from where it starts to the top of its curve. The ring of shaped stone that forms each arch is a full 42 inches thick, 3.5 feet of solid dressed sandstone in the arch alone. The piers stand about 23 feet up from the bed of the river to the line where the arches begin, and they are set directly on the bedrock. Above the crowns of the arches, the stone is carried up another 7 feet to the bed that holds the 4 tracks and the trains. So the profile you are looking at, when you see that low line of arches, is not slight at all. It is a wall of stone dozens of feet thick and dozens of feet tall, and every dimension of it was laid out on paper first, in the Pennsylvania Railroad's engineering office, by an assistant of Brown's named H.S. Ryder, who drew the plans that Nauman and the masons then turned into rock. And they got a piece of luck in that first summer that they seized with both hands. You have to understand what the Susquehanna is first. It is one of the widest rivers in the eastern United States, a broad, shallow sheet of water spread out over a rocky bed, and it is famously moody, low and tame, one season and up over its banks with ice and flood the next. At Rockville it runs nearly a mile from shore to shore. Founding dozens of heavy piers across a river like that would normally be the hardest and most dangerous part of the whole job. But the summer of 1900 brought unusually low water to the Susquehanna. The river dropped, and dropped further, and exposed more of its stony bed than anyone could count on in a normal year. Brown's contractors looked at that low brown water and made a decision that tells you exactly how these men thought. Instead of building a few piers at a time and waiting, they threw down all of the piers at once, up and down the whole length of the crossing, while the low water gave them footing to reach the rock. They raced to get every one of those foundations set on solid bedrock while the river was letting them, because they knew, better than anyone, that the river would not stay low. It never does. Here is why the hurry, and here is where the real danger and the real deadline of this bridge come from. The arches could not be built on air. Every stone arch, while it is going up, has to be supported from below by a temporary wooden frame shaped exactly like the underside of the finished arch. That frame is called falsework, or centering, and the masons lay the arch stones up over it, course by course, from both sides toward the middle, and the whole arch only becomes self-supporting at the very last moment, when the final stone at the top, the keystone, is driven into the crown and locks the ring of stone together. Until that keystone goes in, the wooden centering is carrying the entire half-built arch, and that wooden centering had to stand in the bed of the Susquehanna River. Now you see the trap. Wooden falsework standing in a river cannot survive a Pennsylvania winter. When the Susquehanna freezes and then breaks up, it sends ice down the river in great grinding sheets, and a spring flood behind that ice will smash and carry off any timber framing left standing in the channel. So the men were working against a clock that the river itself was holding. Every arch that got its centering set in the working season had to be built up, closed with its keystone, and have that centering struck out from under it and pulled clear of the water before the ice came. An arch you did not finish in time was an arch whose falsework you might lose over the winter, and with it, all the work standing on it. That is the pressure these crews worked under, and it did not come from a boss shouting at them. It came from the freeze. So the rhythm of the whole job was set by the seasons. Get the piers down onto the bedrock while the water is low. Raise the heavy wooden centering between a pair of piers, a temporary timber arch built just to hold the real one up while it grows. Then bring the arch stones up over that centering from both sides at once. From the 2 lower corners the masons call the haunches, working upward and inward toward the top. Each stone in an arch is cut as a wedge, a little fatter on its outer edge than its inner one, so that when they are all set tight against each other, they cannot fall inward. They can only jam together harder. Hundreds of those shaped wedges go into a single 70-foot arch, and every one is lifted, bedded in mortar, and tapped home by hand. The two sides climb toward each other over the centering until only the gap at the very top is left, and then the masons drive the last wedge, the keystone, down into that gap at the crown, and the instant it seats, the arch stops leaning on the wood and begins to carry itself. Then you strike the centering, knock it loose and lower it away, and the arch stands on nothing but the fit of its own stones. You slide that centering along to the next opening, and you do it again, all of it racing the calendar toward the first hard freeze. Then you hold through the winter on the stable, self-supporting sections you finished in time, and you come back in the spring and do it all over again, arch by arch, until the 6 groups of 8 arches meet and the bridge is whole. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. Let me tell you about the stone itself, and about the men who handled it, because this is the heart of what by hand really means. The bridge is not solid cut stone all the way through. Like a Roman aqueduct, and the comparison is a fair one, it is built with a core of concrete faced and armored in cut stone, the stonework carrying the loads and the weather while the concrete fills the mass behind it. Into that bridge went something on the order of 220,000 tons of stone and about 150,000 cubic yards of concrete. Those are quarry and mountain numbers. 220,000 tons of stone is a small mountain taken apart, moved, and stacked back up in the shape of a bridge. And the stone came from a long way off. It was sandstone, quarried up in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, in the country around a town called Curwensville, well over 100 miles from the bridge site. It had to be cut at the quarry, loaded, hauled down by rail, and then cut and dressed again, and set into the arches at Rockville. This is the Pennsylvania Railroad's own great advantage turned on itself. The railroad that needed the bridge was also the machine that could deliver a mountain of Clearfield sandstone to the riverbank, one trainload at a time. The men who shaped and set that stone were mostly Italian immigrants, skilled stonemasons, and a good number of them came down from that same Clearfield County quarry country to do it, following the stone from the mountain to the river. At the peak of the work there were something like 300 stonemasons on the bridge, and more than 800 men in all when you count the laborers, the derrick crews, the men handling the centering, and everyone else. 300 masons is not a crew. It is a small town of skilled men, each one working a hammer and a chisel and a setting bar, each one responsible for stones that could weigh a great deal, and that had to seat perfectly, because in an arch, a badly cut or badly set stone is a weak point that the load will find and press on for a century. This is the kind of skill that took years to learn, and that does not photograph. A stonemason dressing a wedge of sandstone so its faces meet its neighbors within a hair, and then setting it 40 feet over a river on a bed of mortar, is doing something a machine still cannot fully do today, and these men were doing it 300 at a time, 10 and 12 hours a day, for 2 years. And the work was dangerous in the plain physical way that this kind of building always was, and the calm bridge today hides all of it. Picture what these men were actually doing. They were standing on wooden falsework and on the rising haunches of stone arches, out over a river, swinging heavy dressed blocks into place on derrick lines, guiding great pieces of sandstone down onto a bed of fresh mortar with their hands, in the heat of summer and the cold of a Pennsylvania fall. A man doing that is always one slip, one parted line, one loose stone away from a fall onto rock or into the river. They did it for 2 years, arch after arch, 48 times over. I went looking for the record of what it cost them in injury, and here is what I found, and it is the thing about this whole project that I keep circling back to. The record kept the stone, and the record kept the money, and the record did not keep the men. We know the tonnage of the stone almost to the ton. We know the cubic yards of concrete. We know the bridge cost the Pennsylvania Railroad more than $975,000, a figure some accounts put well above $1 million, and that number was tracked and reported and is easy to find today. What is not easy to find, what is very nearly absent, are the names of the 300 masons and the 800 workers. They come down to us as a count and a nationality. 300 stonemasons, mostly Italian, and almost never as individuals with names and hometowns and families. The ledger of this bridge is precise about everything except the people, because the tonnage was money, and the money got written down, and the men were a labor cost. I would give a great deal to read the name of even one of the masons who set the keystone in one of those 48 arches. As far as the record is concerned, he is part of a number. There is one more piece of the building I have to show you, because it is the detail that made the whole project possible without shutting down the busiest railroad in America, and it is beautifully simple. The Pennsylvania did not tear down the old iron bridge to build the new stone one. That would have severed the main line for 2 years, which was unthinkable. Instead, they built the stone bridge right next to it, just downstream of the 1877 iron span, close enough to reuse the same crossing, but clear enough to work. And they kept running trains across the old iron bridge the entire time the stone one was rising alongside it. Picture that scene for a moment. On one line of piers, the old iron truss, trembling under the constant weight of through traffic. A few dozen feet away, a forest of wooden centering standing in the low water, and 300 masons walking a growing wall of stone up out of the river, arch by arch. Every express, and every freight between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, rolled across the old bridge, day and night, past the men building its replacement, for the 2 years the work took. The through traffic of half a continent never paused for a day. Then, when the stone bridge was finally complete and proven, they swung the tracks over onto the new arches and retired the iron. That switch, the day the trains crossed the stone for the first time, is the real finish line of this story. That day came on the 30th of March, 1902. After 2 years of low water and false work and keystones and Clearfield sandstone, the Pennsylvania Railroad opened the Rockville Bridge to traffic, and the trains came off the old iron span and up onto 48 stone arches for the first time. What they had built was, and remains, the longest stone arch railroad bridge ever built, and the widest, 52 feet across, 4 tracks side by side, 3,820 feet of masonry from bank to bank. It was the single largest stone bridge of its type ever raised, and it had gone up in almost exactly 2 years, entirely by the hands of men with hammers and derricks and mortar. It cost the railroad more than $975,000, and by some accounts well over $1 million, which was an enormous sum at the time, far more than an iron bridge of the same span would have cost. And the Pennsylvania paid it on purpose. That was the whole bargain Cassatt and Brown had made. They spent more up front, once, to buy a bridge that would never again make them close the crossing to replace it. They were not buying a bridge for their own careers. They were buying one for a century they would not live to see, and they knew it, and they built to that horizon anyway. There is a phrase people used for it at the time. They called it the bridge built to last forever. Standing on the bank looking at it, you understand why that did not sound like an exaggeration. Now let me tell you the part that, to me, settles the whole argument Brown was making, because the proof is not in any engineering journal. The proof is that the bridge is still there, and still working, right now. Think about everything that has been thrown at those arches since the day they opened. More than 12 decades of freight, and not the light traffic of that first year either. The trains got heavier decade after decade, far heavier than anything Brown's generation ran, longer and loaded far past what the men who drew these arches ever imagined, and the arches carried all of it without complaint. And then there is the river. The Susquehanna is one of the most flood-prone rivers in the eastern United States, and it has come up over its banks again and again in that time. It came up in the Great St. Patrick's Day flood of 1936, one of the worst that valley has ever seen. It came up again, higher in some places, behind Hurricane Agnes in 1972, a flood that devastated Harrisburg and the whole lower Susquehanna. Time after time, the river has thrown high water and grinding ice straight at those piers, the very thing that would have carried off the wooden falsework in a single winter. And the stones stood through all of it. The piers are still on their bedrock. The arches are still closed on their keystones. Where the railroad has had to touch the bridge across all those years, it has mostly been to add to it rather than repair it. A steel widening in 1939. A repair to the spandrel walls near the end of the century. Always building on the original arches rather than replacing them, because the original arches keep doing exactly what Brown promised they would do. That is Brown's whole case, proven in the only court that matters. He was offered the modern material, iron, and he turned it down because he did not believe it would last on a hard-run railroad without care it would never get. He chose the ancient material instead, cut stone laid in the shape the Romans used, and he bet that it would outlast anything the century could do to it. More than 120 years later, mainline trains still cross the Rockville Bridge every day, Norfolk Southern Freight and Amtrak's Pennsylvanian, riding on masonry that a modern crew has never had to replace. The iron bridge it stood beside is long gone. The stone one Brown built to outlast everything is still the longest of its kind on Earth. So let me leave you where I started, on the bank of the Susquehanna, looking at a bridge that hides its own effort. The next time you see a photograph of a long train curving across a low line of stone arches north of Harrisburg, I want you to know what you are actually looking at. You are looking at 48 arches that were each raised on wooden centering over a live river, against the coming of the ice, and locked shut one keystone at a time. You are seeing hundreds of thousands of tons of Clearfield sandstone that was quarried 100 miles away and set by hand by 300 stonemasons whose names the record almost entirely lost. And you are seeing the judgment of one chief engineer who refused the fashionable material and built for a horizon most builders never even try for. If you have family who worked the quarries of Clearfield County, or who set stone on the Pennsylvania Railroad, I would genuinely like to read their names in the comments, because the ledgers of this bridge kept the tonnage and left the men out, and I think that is exactly backward. We should remember that the longest stone bridge in the world is made of stones that men lifted with their hands. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name, in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.